From soul-crushing commutes to mind-numbing water cooler chats, we often complain about our jobs. But compared to the harrowing occupations of World War I soldiers, our 9-to-5s seem downright pleasant. From the terrifying prospect of charging into battle on a bicycle to the gruesome task of catching rats with bare hands, these soldiers faced unimaginable horrors. Join us as we delve into some of the most grueling jobs of the Great War: wiring parties. Some of the most iconic images of World War I depict the barbed wire-laden landscapes of no man's land. But how did these deadly obstacles come to be? The answer lies in the often overlooked role of wiring parties. These brave soldiers ventured into no man's land at night, repairing damaged barbed wire and cutting enemy defenses. The dangers were immense. A single touch of the barbed wire could inflict painful wounds, and the pitch-black conditions made it difficult to avoid these deadly obstacles. The slightest noise could trigger a barrage of machine gun fire and artillery, while enemy flares could expose their positions to the enemy. Even if they survived the night, wiring parties faced the terrifying task of finding their way back to their own trenches. The darkness and disorientation could lead them astray, leaving them lost and vulnerable. So, the next time you complain about your commute, spare a thought for the soldiers who risked their lives to lay barbed wire in the darkness of no man's land. Artillery observers. You might think that being 6,000 feet in the air would be safer than the trenches of no man's land. However, the job of an artillery observer was far from safe. These brave men were stationed in observation balloons, hovering high above the battlefield to spot enemy movements. While their elevated position made them difficult targets for ground-based weapons, they were vulnerable to aerial attacks. By 1915, enemy aircraft began targeting these balloons, often referred to as sausages, due to their shape. These planes would fire rockets at the hydrogen-filled balloons, causing massive explosions that could kill the observer inside. To mitigate this risk, observation balloons were equipped with parachutes. In the event of an attack, the observer could bail out and land safely on the ground. However, strong winds could carry the parachutist into enemy territory, putting their life in danger. So, while the view from an observation balloon may have been breathtaking, the job was incredibly dangerous. As an observer, you were constantly at risk of being shot down, blown up, or captured. Want to learn more about the horrors and heroism of World War I? Subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories. High-flying danger. Let's talk about high-flying heroes, airplane pilots. By the time World War I erupted, airplanes were still in their infancy, with the first powered flight taking place just over a decade earlier. Early aircraft were rudimentary at best. Fragile wooden contraptions with open cockpits that exposed pilots to freezing temperatures, low oxygen at altitude, and countless dangers. Navigational tools were non-existent, so pilots relied on basic maps and often flew low to follow railway lines, reading station names to stay on course. At the start of the war, aircraft were mainly used for reconnaissance, tracking enemy troop movements. However, as their strategic value became clear, both sides took measures to disrupt these aerial observers. The conflict quickly escalated to include airborne combat, and pilots resorted to using pistols, rifles, and even bricks to attack enemies at close range. Yes, bricks. Imagine being hit with one while piloting a rickety airplane thousands of feet in the air. The risks were staggering. Ground fire from enemy troops and tanks was ever present, but the most daunting threats came from the air. The job was so dangerous that 8,000 pilots in Britain's Royal Flying Corps died during training alone. For those who made it into combat, the average life expectancy was a chilling 18 airborne hours. It's safe to say that being a World War I pilot was anything but safe. It was one of the most perilous jobs in history. Sentry duty in World War I. World War I is infamous for the deadly expanse of no man's land. Crossing this treacherous terrain was a death sentence. To guard against enemy incursions, soldiers were assigned sentry duty, a perilous task that required constant vigilance. Stationed on the raised step of the trench, sentries had to keep a watchful eye for enemy movements. They were high-value targets, and enemy snipers often sought to eliminate them. However, the greatest threat to a sentry's life was often their own commanders. Sentry duty was a grueling task, especially during the dark, cold nights. Soldiers were expected to remain alert, even when exhaustion crept in. falling asleep on duty was a serious offence, punishable by death. In a tragic case, New Zealand soldier Jack Dunn contracted pneumonia while on the front lines. Despite his illness, he was forced to return to duty. When he was caught sleeping on sentry duty, he was sentenced to death. While his sentence was later commuted, it highlights the severe consequences of failing to fulfill this critical role. Trench raiders. In the grim landscape of World War I, a specialized group of soldiers emerged, the trench raiders. These courageous men dared to venture into the perilous no-man's land, infiltrating enemy lines to carry out daring missions. Clad in dark uniforms and armed with a variety of silent weapons, trench raiders would stealthily approach enemy trenches under the cover of darkness. Their primary objective was to eliminate sentries without alerting the enemy. Once inside the enemy trench, they would carry out their mission, which could involve killing defenders, destroying weapons, capturing prisoners, or gathering intelligence. If detected, the trench raiders would engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat using bayonets, trench knives, knuckle dusters, and spiked clubs. Gunfire was avoided to minimize the risk of drawing attention. After completing their mission, the raiders would signal their comrades with a grenade blast, creating a smoke screen that would hopefully cover their retreat. The survivors would then race back to their own lines, hoping to evade capture or death. The courage and sacrifice of these brave soldiers were extraordinary. Their daring raids often had a significant impact on the course of the war. The iron coffins. What could be safer than rolling across the battlefield in a 30-ton, heavily armored mega-machine? As it turns out, almost anything. Early tanks, while intimidating in appearance, were fraught with design flaws. For starters, their enormous size and weight made them painfully slow, crawling along at a top speed of just 5 miles per hour. This sluggish pace turned them into easy targets for enemy soldiers, who could fire at them, or worse, plant landmines under their tracks, often with devastating results for the crew inside. Despite their heavy exterior, World War I tanks were poorly armored. A single bullet could penetrate the hull, sending shards of metal flying around the interior, endangering the crew. To make matters worse, the engine design of these early tanks left much to be desired. Engines were large, inefficient, and placed in the center of the tank. They heated up quickly, and any unlucky crew member who fell against the exhaust could suffer fatal burns. Unfortunately, falling inside the tank was a very real danger. These unwieldy machines had to navigate boggy battlefields riddled with trenches and ditches. Without suspension or seatbelts, the crew inside were tossed around like pinballs in a metal arcade. It's safe to say that anyone assigned to this job probably wasn't feeling very thankful. The Bicycle Brigade. In the midst of the mechanized warfare of World War I, a seemingly archaic mode of transport emerged as a surprising tool of war: the bicycle. Bicycle brigades were formed in several countries, including Canada, where cyclists were used to transport troops and supplies quickly and efficiently. In some cases, these bicycle units even saw action on the front lines, a truly bizarre sight in the age of machine guns and artillery. While bicycles offered mobility and efficiency, they provided little protection against enemy fire. Cyclists were vulnerable to bullets, shrapnel, and gas attacks. Despite the risks, these brave soldiers pedaled into battle, demonstrating the ingenuity and adaptability of the human spirit. It's hard to imagine a bicycle cavalry charging into battle against tanks and artillery. Yet, in the chaos of World War I, even the most absurd ideas could find a place on the battlefield. The tin openers. While the horrors of trench warfare dominated the land battles of World War I, a different kind of danger lurked beneath the waves. The submarine war raged on, and with every sunken vessel, a potential treasure trove of intelligence was lost to the depths. To recover this vital information, a secretive unit of divers, known as the Tin Openers, was formed. These brave men ventured into the perilous depths, navigating minefields and underwater currents to penetrate the wrecks of sunken submarines. Their task was both dangerous and gruesome. They had to contend with the risks of decompression sickness, hypothermia, and the ever-present threat of underwater explosions. The wreckage itself was a death trap, filled with sharp metal, toxic gases, and the remains of the submarine's crew. The Tin Openers were true pioneers of underwater exploration. Their daring missions, though often overlooked, played a crucial role in the war effort. Their bravery and sacrifice deserve to be remembered. Tunnelers. While the surface of the Western Front was a chaotic battlefield, a silent war raged beneath the earth. Tunnelers, skilled miners, were tasked with digging intricate networks of tunnels beneath no man's land. Their goal was to plant explosives under enemy trenches, creating devastating explosions and breaches in the enemy lines. The conditions in these subterranean tunnels were harsh and dangerous. The work was physically demanding, often requiring miners to crawl through narrow, muddy tunnels for hours on end. The constant threat of cave-ins, flooding, and enemy attacks added to the peril. One of the most insidious dangers was carbon monoxide poisoning. The poor ventilation in the tunnels made it easy for this deadly gas to accumulate, leading to suffocation. To combat this threat, some tunnelers were equipped with rudimentary breathing apparatus, allowing them to venture into the gas-filled tunnels to rescue their comrades. The underground battles between tunnelers were intense and often brutal. When two tunnels from opposing sides intersected, hand-to-hand combat would ensue, with miners using shovels, picks, and whatever else they could find as weapons. The tunnelers of World War I were unsung heroes who risked their lives to shape the course of the war. Their work was essential to the Allied victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Fortunately, some miners had a savior in the form of proto-men, rescuers equipped with special breathing apparatuses that supplied pure oxygen. These heroes descended into the suffocating depths to retrieve incapacitated tunnelers, saving lives in the most nightmarish of conditions. Still, imagine waking up 100 feet underground gasping for air, only to see a masked figure looming over you in the dim light. Even getting rescued as a tunneler was utterly terrifying. Munitionettes. Heroic as the work of tunnelers was, none of it would have been possible without the contributions of women hundreds of miles away. Specifically, the women back in Britain who worked tirelessly in munitions factories, producing bullets, shells, and explosives to support the war effort. While it might seem like a safer job compared to the battlefield, the reality was far from it. These women, nicknamed munitionettes, endured grueling 12-hour shifts, but the long hours were the least of their worries. They often worked with TNT or trinitrotoluene, a highly toxic substance. Prolonged exposure to the nitric acid used in the process turned their skin a sickly yellow, earning them the moniker Canary Girls. Beyond the unusual discoloration, constant exposure to these chemicals caused severe health problems, including skin irritation, liver failure, and kidney damage. The danger didn't stop there. The explosive materials they handled were notoriously volatile. Accidents were devastating, with entire factories sometimes reduced to rubble in seconds. In 1918, a catastrophic explosion at a shell factory in Nottingham, England, killed more than 130 workers. Working conditions were so hazardous that many factory workers wore identification tags, not for convenience, but so their remains could be identified in the event of a fatal accident. It's safe to say that this was one unsatisfactory job, the rat catchers. Whether it was the muddy, waterlogged terrain that led to trench foot, the poor hygiene, or the cramped cold conditions, the trenches were no place you'd want to spend much time. However, arguably the worst aspect of trench life was the sheer number of rats that ran riot in these spaces. Millions of oversized rats, bloated and emboldened by the food and waste left by stationary armies, became a major pest. The rats grew so large and daring that they'd even chew on wounded soldiers as they lay helpless. These terrifying creatures not only ravaged food supplies and wiring, but also spread deadly diseases like typhus and trench fever. The obvious solution might seem to be shooting them on sight, but ammunition was limited, so firing at rats was strictly prohibited. Instead, rat-catching dogs were employed to hunt them down, and some unlucky soldiers had to resort to using bayonets or even their bare hands to deal with the infestation. Can you imagine the grim task of crawling through the mud, hoping to catch a rat that had been tormenting you for weeks? Despite how undesirable this job was, soldiers were paid for every rat they killed. One soldier, for example, disposed of a staggering 8,000 rats in just a fortnight, earning half a penny per rat, about £16, which is roughly $33,000 in today's money. But no amount of money could erase the nightmares that would likely haunt these rat catchers for years to come. Stretcher bearers. On the battlefield, troops weren't allowed to stop and care for their fallen comrades. This responsibility fell to stretcher bearers. These men were often non-combatants, individuals who were willing to enlist and serve their country but couldn't bear the act of fighting. While stretcher bearers may have taken on a more peaceful role, their job was anything but easy. Typically, there were only 4 stretcher bearers for every 200 men, and considering that during World War I, approximately 6,000 soldiers died and another 18,000 were injured each day, these men had their work cut out for them. In ideal conditions, 2 bearers could carry a wounded man to safety, but such conditions were rare. Given the swampy, muddy fields and giant craters that plagued the war, it often took as many as 6 men to carry a stretcher across the battlefield after a heavy rain. Can you imagine hauling a soldier through a soggy bog while your boots sink into the muck? Not only was the work exhausting, but it was also perilous. Stretcher bearers were tasked with retrieving injured soldiers from the front lines, placing them squarely in the line of enemy fire. Many of these men were tragically caught while trying to save their comrades. One unit of 48 stretcher bearers lost 42 men in battle. It's safe to say this was one of the war's most dangerous and physically demanding jobs. Runners. But stretcher bearers weren't the only ones with physically demanding roles during the war. Armies needed to communicate messages between units, but by the early 20th century, wireless communication was still in its infancy. The most reliable means of communication were humans, specifically runners. These individuals were low-ranking corporals, selected for their fitness, stamina, and map-reading ability. Runners didn't just cover long distances, they had to navigate barbed wire, dodge through water-filled craters, and, of course, avoid being hit by enemy fire. In 1917, one runner was tasked with delivering a message to a British machine gun position in no man's land. Traveling in the dark, he became lost. To make matters worse, German forces spotted him and fired a flare, illuminating his position before starting to shell him. After the bombardment, the runner was buried alive with only his head above the mud. When he was finally pulled out, he was in a state of shock and remembered nothing for the next day. That runner was one of the lucky ones. As World War I veteran Lieutenant Alan Dexter once said, "For a runner, it was simply a question of how long they would last. Yikes, safe to say, I'd run far away from taking on that job." Flamethrowers. Flamethrowers. Incendiary devices designed to blast a jet stream of fire. Sounds pretty badass, right? You'd think any flamethrower operators from World War I would be well equipped to burn their way through anything that stood in their path. However, these soldiers had one of the least desirable jobs of the war. When the war broke out in 1914, modern flamethrowers were still a new invention, and as a result, the early models were bulky and cumbersome. Due to their size, flamethrower operators were slow-moving, making them prime targets for enemy snipers and artillery. And as you can imagine, if a bullet hit a flamethrower's flammable tank, it didn't end well. British officer Philip Christon witnessed this firsthand. The round hit the flamethrower, and with a scream, the man collapsed in a sheet of flame. Yeah, that's one job that quite literally fires you. Naval mine sweepers. After all that talk of fire, let's cool off a bit, and what better place to do that than the sea? As we've already seen with the work of tin openers, Europe's seas during World War I were filled with naval mines. In the North Sea alone, there were an estimated 235,000 mines, and it was up to the naval minesweepers to clear up these ticking time bombs. Large trawlers would head out to sea, using wired nets to sweep for mines and bring them to the surface. When it came to defusing them, you'd think these men would be as delicate as possible, right? Not during World War I. The approach was much more direct. Minesweepers would simply shoot at the mines to detonate them. Now, let's hope those shooting at the mines gave themselves enough room to avoid being blasted into fish food. Unfortunately, these mine-sweeping trawlers didn't always have that luxury. In 1915, HMS Agamemnon was one of the unlucky ones. The vessel collided with a submerged German mine, sending 9 of her crew members to a watery grave. It really gives you a sinking feeling, doesn't it? Human torpedo. By now, it's clear that working at sea during World War I was essentially a death wish. Yet, there was one naval assignment that was even more perilous than the rest. Throughout the war, Both sides used torpedoes to target enemy ships and submarines. While that sounds like standard practice, there was one torpedo that did things a little differently. In 1915, Italian naval engineer Raffaele Rossetti designed the human torpedo. Yes, you heard that right, a torpedo with a crew. So, how did it work? First, the torpedo was towed within range of its target. Once positioned, it was launched with two brave or unlucky crewmen saddled on top. If you're imagining them speeding through the water like a James Bond stunt, think again. Powered by a 17-inch propeller and a compressed air engine, the torpedo trudged along at a sluggish 4 knots, less than 5 miles per hour. While this slow pace allowed the crew to maintain their balance, it didn't exactly offer a speedy getaway. Let's hope they didn't encounter any hungry sharks along the way. Although the crew wore diving suits, they had no breathing apparatus. Instead, the torpedo floated just below the water's surface so the crew could keep their heads above water as they navigated toward the target. One silver lining, the human torpedo wasn't a kamikaze mission. It carried two 375-pound explosive charges at the front, which the crew could detach and clamp onto the enemy ship's keel before making their escape. In October 1918, the human torpedo and its 2 crewmen finally saw action. Despite battling strong currents, they successfully reached the hull of the Austro-Hungarian battleship SMS Viribus Unitis. But just moments after securing the explosives, they were discovered and taken prisoner. Still, being captured beats being plunged into the depths of the sea or going down with the torpedo. And that wraps up the list of the worst jobs in World War I. Which profession do you think was the most perilous? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.